The water hit her like a wall of ice, and before the first gasp even left her lungs, Sergeant Emily Thompson was already moving. Not screaming, not flinching, moving. Her hand found the rifle propped against her bunk before her eyes had even fully opened, and in that instant, three grown men who thought they were about to have the laugh of their lives realized they'd made a terrible miscalculation. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing who's listening. It was 0400 hours at Fort Caldwell, the kind of hour when the barracks lights hummed low and the world outside was still wrapped in that thick, unbothered darkness only soldiers and insomniacs ever really know. Thompson had been asleep for exactly 90 minutes. 3 days of field exercises had drained her down to nothing but bone and instinct, and sleep, when it finally came, had come like a mercy. She didn't dream. She simply existed in that black, weightless space where the body finally stops fighting. Sergeant Duncan didn't see it that way. To him, and to the two men snickering behind him, she was simply the newest target in a barracks tradition older than any of them. The kind of initiation that got passed down like a bad inheritance, one bucket of freezing water at a time. He told himself it was harmless. He told himself everyone went through it. He didn't ask himself why he'd waited until she, specifically, was the one sound asleep, or why some small, honest part of him already felt the shape of regret before the water even left the bucket. The bucket tipped. The water fell in a silver sheet, catching the dull light of the overhead fixtures, and for one suspended half-second, everything in that room seemed to hold its breath. Then it hit her. And here is the thing about people who have spent months training their bodies to respond before their minds catch up. Shock does not put them on the floor. It puts them on their feet. Thompson came up off that bunk in a single fluid motion, water streaming down her face, her hair coming loose from its knot, and her hand already closed around the grip of her weapon. Her eyes, wide and sharp and utterly awake now, locked onto Duncan with an intensity that made his laughter die somewhere in his throat. The room went silent. Even the water dripping from the bunk above sounded suddenly loud. She thought the barracks were her safe place. She was wrong. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Duncan stood there with the empty bucket still tilted in his hand, his grin frozen halfway between amusement and dawning horror. Behind him, the two other soldiers who had been laughing seconds ago now wore the pale, uncertain faces of men watching a joke curdle into something else entirely. Somewhere down the row of bunks, another soldier sat up slowly, not daring to speak. Thompson's chest rose and fell hard, adrenaline flooding a body that had been dead asleep only seconds before. Her training didn't ask her whether this was a joke. Her training only knew one thing: threat, response, survive. It took her a full 3 seconds, an eternity in that frozen room, to separate the nightmare her nervous system had prepared for from the reality in front of her. Not an ambush, not a threat, just cruelty dressed up as camaraderie. And in those 3 seconds, something in her chest cracked open. Because it wasn't really about the water. It was about every night she'd had to prove she belonged in a room full of men who still, some small ugly part of them, needed her to flinch. It was about the quiet exhaustion of being the only one who had to earn her rest twice. Once through the exercises, and once through simply being tolerated. Duncan set the bucket down. His laughter was gone now, replaced by something quieter, something almost like shame creeping up the back of his neck. "It's tradition," he said, but his voice had lost its conviction halfway through the sentence. "Tradition," Thompson repeated, low and even, lowering her weapon with deliberate slowness, "doesn't get to decide when I'm allowed to feel safe." Nobody laughed after that. What happened in the following days wasn't punishment in the way anyone expected. There was no court-martial, no dramatic confrontation in front of the whole unit. Instead, something quieter took root. A conversation, first between Thompson and her platoon sergeant, then between the platoon sergeant and Duncan himself. Duncan, to his credit, didn't defend himself. He sat across from her in the mess hall 3 days later, uninvited but not unwelcome, and simply said, "I didn't think about what it would feel like from where you were standing." It wasn't a grand apology. It didn't need to be. Sometimes the smallest sentences carry the most weight. By the end of that week, something in the barracks had shifted, not into resentment, but into a kind of grudging, hard-won respect. The soldiers who had laughed learned to look twice before mistaking exhaustion for weakness. And Thompson, dog tags still damp against her collarbone some mornings, learned that her strength hadn't needed proving. It had simply needed witnessing. Because kindness doesn't vanish. It waits, and it finds its way back, sometimes in the shape of an apology nobody thought they'd hear. And somewhere in that cold barracks, under buzzing lights and dripping water, a young soldier once soaked in fear became the reason an entire unit learned what respect actually looks like. If this story moved you, tell me, have you ever had to prove your strength to people who should have already seen it? Drop a comment, share where you're watching from, and if stories like this speak to you, subscribe, because there's another one waiting, and I think you'll want to hear it.